So, when you think about Jesus as a teacher, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For most of us, it's his parables, right? The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, they're just iconic. But here's the fascinating part. That wasn't always his go-to teaching style. For a long time, he taught super directly, very plainly. And then, all of a sudden, everything changed.
And that's really the core question we're diving into here. Why would a master communicator, someone known for his clarity, suddenly start telling these stories that, honestly, confused a lot of people? What was he trying to do by speaking in riddles?
Okay, first things first. Let's make sure we're on the same page about what a parable even is. At its heart, it's a teaching tool. The word itself comes from a Greek term that means to cast alongside. The whole idea is you take a simple, earthly story, something about farming or a family, stuff people understood, and you lay it down right next to a deep spiritual truth to help make that truth clear. Or was that the only reason?
To really get this, we have to look at how this shift actually went down. Because it wasn't some slow, gradual change. It was a sharp, sudden pivot.
For the first part of his public ministry, Jesus' teachings were incredibly direct. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. It's a straightforward sermon, right? It's not a collection of cryptic stories. The parables were a very deliberate choice he made later in the game.
And this timeline just lays it all out so clearly. You've got that early period of just direct teaching. Then, bam, you hit Matthew chapter 13, and it's like a switch is flipped. From that moment on, whenever he's talking to the public, to the crowds, he speaks only in parables. It's a huge change in his whole strategy.
So, what was it? What was the trigger for this massive pivot? Well, it all boils down to one specific, really high-stakes confrontation.
And it wasn't just us looking back 2,000 years later who were confused. His own disciples were totally bewildered. They actually pulled him aside and asked him point blank, "Hey, why are you suddenly speaking to everyone in stories?" They knew something big had changed.
Well, the answer seems to be right there in the chapter just before the parables start, Matthew 12. This is the moment where the religious leaders, the Pharisees, publicly and officially reject Jesus. And they don't just disagree with him, they accuse him of getting his power from Satan. This huge national act of rejection was the turning point. It changed his entire communication strategy.
So in response to this public rejection, Jesus does something absolutely brilliant. He adopts this new strategy that can speak to two completely different groups of people at the exact same time.
This is where we see the genius behind the parables. They were designed to be both a window and a wall. For anyone who is genuinely curious, who really wanted to understand, the stories were like a window opening up to these profound spiritual truths. But for those who had already made up their minds and rejected him, the stories were like a wall, concealing a truth they had zero interest in anyway.
So it kind of became this spiritual filter, right? The sincere seekers, the disciples, they would lean in. They'd hear these stories and try to unlock the deeper meaning. The hostile critics or the people who just didn't care, they just shrug it off as a silly, irrelevant story about some farmer. But, and this is so important, in private, Jesus would pull his disciples aside and explain every single thing. The truth was never hidden from those who genuinely wanted it.
All right, so that's the why. But what about us today? How do we make sure we're in the group that gets it? How do we unlock these stories for ourselves? Let's break down a really practical toolkit for interpretation.
It really boils down to three key things. First, always look for the setup, the context. A lot of times, the text will flat out tell you what the parable is about before it even starts. Second, you have to separate the main point, let's call that the meat, from the storytelling details, the ornament. And third, whatever you think a parable means, it has to line up with what the rest of Scripture teaches clearly.
Let's take the parable of the sower. It's a perfect example of this whole meat versus ornament idea. When Jesus explains it himself, he doesn't give a symbolic meaning to every single little detail. The fact that it's a sower, or that there are exactly 4 kinds of soil, isn't the main point. The point is the core truth that each part illustrates. The message of the gospel goes out, and people respond to it in different ways.
And this leads to a really important rule of thumb here. Parables are meant to be illustrations. They're not meant to be the foundation for a brand new belief. You shouldn't be building some complex new theology from a minor detail in a story. A parable is there to shine a light on a truth that's taught much more directly somewhere else.
And all of this kind of brings us to the ultimate point behind this whole teaching method. It's not just about figuring out stories, it's about the posture of our own hearts.
So often, Jesus would wrap up a parable with this powerful little phrase. He was basically saying, hey, Don't just hear this as a simple story. Listen. Listen with a real desire to understand. Engage your heart, engage your mind. He put the responsibility on the listener to actually seek out the meaning.
And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? The parables prove that the exact same message can land in completely different ways, all depending on the listener. It makes you wonder, in our own lives, with all the information we're taking in every single day, what might we be missing? What could we understand differently if we just learned how to truly listen?